I grew up fishing the Gulf Coast, and after enough years on the water, you learn something important. Most ocean horror stories have reasonable explanations. Fog looks like ships. Broken radios create strange signals. Exhaustion makes people hear things that aren't there. That's what I kept telling myself the night we answered the distress call. There were 3 of us aboard the Sea Finch that weekend. Me, my best friend Ryan, and Ryan's older brother Cole. We'd chartered the boat for a 2-day deep sea fishing trip, nearly 80 miles offshore. The weather forecast was perfect, the water was calm, and by sunset, we'd already filled half the cooler. Around 10:30 p.m., we killed the engines and drifted while setting up for overnight fishing. The ocean was completely black. No moon, no nearby boats, just endless darkness stretching in every direction. Ryan was checking lines when the radio crackled suddenly. At first, it sounded like ordinary static. Then a voice came through. Mayday. Mayday. This is the fishing vessel Mariner, taking on water. The 3 of us looked at each other immediately. The voice sounded distorted, but clear enough. A man, middle-aged, panicked. We're approximately 40 miles south of Beacon Shoal. We need immediate assistance. Cole grabbed the radio microphone. This is the Sea Finch. We copy your distress call. Repeat your position. Several seconds passed. Then the voice returned. Same fear. Same urgency. He repeated the coordinates. Cole checked the chart plotter. The location was less than 20 minutes away. Let's move, he said. Nobody argued. If another boat was in trouble, you helped. That's just how it worked. We pulled lines, started the engines, and headed toward the coordinates. The entire trip there, the captain continued transmitting. His situation seemed to be getting worse. Water rising, electrical problems, engine failure. Everything sounded real, terrifyingly real. Then we reached the location and found nothing. No lights, no vessel, no debris. Nothing. The ocean stretched empty beneath the stars. Cole slowed the boat and scanned the horizon. Mariner, this is the Sea Finch. We are at your position. Static. Then the captain responded. You should be able to see us. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Because we couldn't. Not even a light. Cole grabbed binoculars. Still nothing. You sure about those coordinates? He asked. Positive. The answer came instantly. Too instantly, as if the man had expected the question. Ryan switched on the radar. Empty. No vessels within range. The radio crackled again. The captain sounded frustrated now. I can see your boat. Nobody spoke. The ocean suddenly felt much larger. Cole frowned into the darkness. What do you mean you can see us? Several seconds passed. Then the response came. I see 3 men. My pulse quickened. The voice continued. 1 standing near the stern. Ryan slowly lowered the fishing rod he was holding. The captain kept talking. 1 at the helm. Cole froze. And 1 sitting beside the cooler. That was me. For a moment, nobody moved. The radio hissed softly. Then, the captain spoke again. You can hear me, can't you? The fear in his voice sounded genuine, almost desperate. I grabbed the microphone. Who are you? The answer came immediately. Captain David Mercer. I glanced at Ryan. Neither of us recognized the name. What's the name of your vessel? I asked. The Mariner. The signal crackled violently for a moment. Then the captain added something that made my skin crawl. We've been drifting for hours. A pause. The storm came out of nowhere. I looked around at the calm ocean. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. What storm? Silence. Then, the storm from August. Cole slowly turned toward me. It was May. The captain continued speaking. You need to leave. His tone had changed completely. No panic, just fear. Raw fear. Leave now. The radio emitted a burst of static so loud we all flinched. Then the transmission disappeared. The silence that followed felt unnatural. We spent another hour searching the area. Nothing, no vessel, no debris, no emergency beacon. Eventually we convinced ourselves it had been some kind of radio malfunction and headed back toward shore. Nobody talked much during the trip home. The next morning, Ryan started digging into maritime records, mostly out of curiosity. That curiosity vanished quickly. Around noon, he called me. His voice sounded different. You're not gonna like this. A few hours later, the three of us were sitting inside a Coast Guard office, looking through archived reports. The file sat open on the table between us. Fishing vessel, Mariner, Captain, David Mercer. Crew 4, date, lost, August 14th, 2012. 12 years earlier. The vessel had disappeared during a severe storm approximately 40 miles south of Beacon Shoal, exactly where we'd received the distress call. No wreckage was ever found. No survivors, no bodies. The Coast Guard officially listed all crew members as lost at sea. Ryan pointed to the captain's photograph. I felt my stomach drop immediately. It was him. Not because I'd seen him in person, because I'd heard him. Somehow, impossibly, I recognized the voice. The officer watching us noticed our expressions. You okay? Cole explained everything. The distress call, the coordinates, the conversation, the description of our boat. The officer listened politely. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair. You're not the first fisherman to report hearing that transmission. The room went silent. What? I asked. The officer nodded. Over the years, we've received a handful of similar reports. Nobody spoke. The officer closed the file. Most people assume it's radio interference. And you? Cole asked. The man hesitated. Then he looked directly at us. I think something happened out there that night. A long silence followed. Finally, I asked the question none of us wanted answered. What happened to the Mariner? The officer stared at the old photograph for several seconds. Then he quietly replied, If I knew that. He closed the file. They wouldn't still be looking for it. To this day, I still fish offshore. I've heard strange things on the radio. Most have perfectly reasonable explanations, but every August, whenever I'm near Beacon Shoal, I turn the volume down. Because part of me is afraid I'll hear that voice again, and part of me is afraid I won't. Because if Captain David Mercer was really out there for those few minutes that night, then somewhere in the Gulf, a fishing boat may still be drifting through a storm that ended 12 years ago. The Mary Ellen left Port Mason at 5:42 on a Friday morning. 3 men were aboard. Nathan Briggs, 48, owned the boat and had spent most of his life fishing the waters off the Oregon coast. His younger brother Luke worked with him during the season, and a 22-year-old deckhand named Eric Walsh had joined the crew earlier that year. None of them were inexperienced. None of them were reckless. And according to every piece of evidence investigators later recovered, none of them should have disappeared. The weather that weekend was nearly perfect. Clear skies, calm water, light wind. The kind of forecast fishermen hope for. Several other boats saw the Mary Ellen leave the harbor that morning. Nathan even radioed another captain around noon, joking about finally getting a weekend without rough seas. That was the last confirmed communication anyone ever received from the vessel. When the boat failed to return Sunday evening, nobody panicked immediately. Delays happened all the time. Mechanical problems. Bigger catches than expected. Minor equipment failures. But by midnight, family members began making calls. By dawn Monday morning, the Coast Guard was involved. The search started shortly after sunrise. Aircraft combed the coastline. Patrol boats searched known fishing areas. Radio broadcasts went out repeatedly. No response. Then, just after 3 p.m., a harbor worker spotted something approaching the entrance channel. At first, he assumed it was another fishing vessel returning from the weekend. Then he realized something was wrong. The boat wasn't following a normal course. It drifted slowly between the breakwaters before bumping gently against a dock. The vessel was the Mary Ellen, and nobody was on board. The engine was still running. That detail immediately disturbed investigators. Fishing gear remained exactly where it should have been. The radios worked, navigation systems functioned normally. Fuel tanks still held enough fuel for another day on the water. Nothing suggested a major emergency. Even stranger, personal belongings remained on board. Nathan's wallet, Luke's jacket, Eric's phone. The cooler still contained food. Coffee sat inside a mug near the wheelhouse. Everything looked as though the crew had simply stepped away moments earlier, except there was nowhere for them to step. The ocean doesn't give people that option. News of the abandoned boat spread quickly. Within days, theories exploded online. Pirates, kidnappings, drug trafficking, even murder. But investigators focused on something much simpler. The evidence suggested nobody had attacked the crew. No blood, no signs of violence, no damage to the vessel, no struggle. Whatever happened had happened suddenly, and likely involved the men themselves. The first significant clue came from the boat's GPS history. Investigators downloaded the route data and reconstructed the vessel's movements over the missing weekend. For most of Saturday, everything looked normal. The Mary Ellen drifted through several productive fishing areas, stopping occasionally before moving again. Then, something unusual happened shortly after sunset. The boat's speed dropped dramatically, almost to zero, for nearly 40 minutes. Then the vessel began moving again. No distress calls were made, no emergency beacon activated. Nothing. Just a strange pause. The second clue came from the deck itself. One of the Coast Guard investigators noticed a fishing line wrapped tightly around a railing near the stern. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, until they traced it back to a heavy tuna rig. The line had clearly been under enormous tension before snapping. Experienced fishermen reviewing the evidence offered a possible explanation. A large fish may have taken the bait, possibly a very large one, something powerful enough to pull unexpectedly. That theory led investigators toward a disturbing possibility. Imagine Eric working the line alone. A sudden strike, a slip, a fall overboard. Not impossible. In fact, it happened more often than most people realized. The next question was obvious. If Eric went overboard, why didn't the others save him? The answer may have been equally simple. Nathan or Luke likely noticed immediately. One of them rushed toward the stern. Maybe too quickly. Maybe without securing themselves first. One bad step, one wave, one misplaced grab for a railing. Then a second man goes into the water. Now only one crew member remains on board. Alone. Panicking. Trying to maneuver the boat while locating two men in open ocean after dark. Fishermen who reviewed the case believe the final crew member may have attempted a rescue turn, a difficult maneuver under stress, especially at night, especially if he wasn't expecting it. Perhaps he leaned too far. Perhaps he slipped. Perhaps he jumped intentionally trying to reach one of the others. Nobody knows. And that's the problem. Nobody knows. Because no witness survived. The theory made sense. It fit the evidence. Yet it left behind questions that investigators could never answer. For example, why was the engine still running when the boat returned? Why was the autopilot engaged? Why did the GPS show several unusual course corrections hours after the crew likely disappeared? The most likely explanation was that the vessel continued drifting while the autopilot repeatedly adjusted course automatically. But likely isn't the same as certain. Months passed, then years. No bodies were ever recovered. The Pacific rarely gives people back. Eventually, the official investigation concluded. The final report stated that the most probable explanation was a chain reaction man-overboard accident resulting in the loss of all 3 crew members. Case closed, at least officially. But one detail still bothers people in Port Mason. A detail that never appeared in newspaper articles. The harbor worker who first spotted the Mary Ellen returning to shore gave a statement investigators couldn't explain. He repeated it multiple times during interviews and never changed his story. According to him, when the boat emerged from the fog that afternoon, someone was standing inside the wheelhouse. Just for a second. A silhouette. A person at the helm. The figure disappeared before the boat reached the dock. Investigators dismissed the observation as a trick of light, exhaustion, or distance. And maybe they were right. After all, everything else about the case points toward a tragic accident. No mystery vessel, no criminal conspiracy, no sea monster lurking beneath the waves. Just 3 experienced fishermen caught in a sequence of mistakes that spiraled into disaster. That's the explanation most people accept. It's certainly the most logical one. But even today, the Mary Ellen sits in dry storage outside Port Mason. And every now and then, someone working late near the harbor swears they see movement through the dusty wheelhouse windows. Usually only for a moment, usually just before sunset. Long enough to make them look twice. And long enough to remember that while investigators may know how the story probably ended, nobody knows exactly what happened on that boat during its final night at sea. The first thing Captain Ryan Holt noticed was the color. The survival suit floating in the water wasn't bright orange like modern emergency gear. It was a faded yellow, the kind of color safety equipment turns after decades of exposure to sunlight. The second thing he noticed was that it was moving, not drifting, swimming. "Starboard side," one of the deckhands called. Ryan stepped out of the wheelhouse and raised his binoculars. About 300 yards away, a figure floated in the gray morning water of the North Pacific. At first, he assumed it was debris. Then the figure lifted an arm. Everyone aboard the Northern Star froze, because there was a person inside the suit, alive. The fishing vessel altered course immediately. Nobody hesitated. Out here, you didn't leave people in the water. 10 minutes later, the crew hauled the man aboard. He looked to be in his early 40s, exhausted but conscious. Salt water dripped from the survival suit while he sat on the deck coughing violently. "Easy," Ryan said, handing him a blanket. The man nodded weakly. His lips were blue from the cold. His hands shook. But he was alive, which made no sense. The nearest shipping route was over 50 miles away. The nearest land was even farther. "What's your name?" Ryan asked. The man swallowed. "Daniel Mercer." "Where's your vessel?" Daniel stared at him blankly. "The Arlington." Nobody on the crew recognized the name. Ryan crouched beside him. "What happened?" Daniel looked confused. "Our engine room flooded during the storm." Ryan glanced toward the sky. The weather had been calm for nearly a week. "What storm?" Daniel frowned. "The storm last night." Silence settled over the deck. The crew exchanged uncomfortable looks. There had been no storm. Not last night. Not recently. Ryan assumed the man was disoriented. Hypothermia could do strange things to people. So they brought him inside the cabin, gave him dry clothes, hot coffee, and time to recover. The strange part was that Daniel seemed genuinely confused by everything around him. modern GPS systems, smartphones, digital navigation screens. He stared at them as if seeing them for the first time. At one point, he picked up a crew member's phone and simply asked, "What is this?" Everyone laughed nervously. Daniel didn't. He was serious. By afternoon, the Northern Star contacted the Coast Guard. A rescue helicopter was dispatched. While waiting, Ryan decided to ask a few more questions. What port was the Arlington operating out of? Astoria. How many crew members? 7. What year was the vessel built? Daniel answered immediately. 1987. Ryan paused. 1987? Daniel nodded. Yeah. The answer lingered awkwardly between them, because it was 2026. Ryan eventually asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. What year do you think it is? Daniel looked at him strangely. 2001. Nobody spoke. For a moment, the only sound inside the cabin was the hum of the engines. Then, one of the crew laughed nervously. Good one. Daniel didn't smile. His expression remained completely serious. The helicopter arrived shortly afterward and transported him to shore. Ryan assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, a Coast Guard investigator contacted him. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but Ryan remembered every word. Where did you find him? Ryan provided the coordinates. The investigator was silent for several seconds. Then he asked, Are you sure that's where you picked him up? Positive. Another long pause. Finally, the investigator said, We need you to come in. The meeting took place at a Coast Guard office overlooking the harbor. Ryan expected routine paperwork. Instead, the investigator placed a photograph on the table. An old photograph. Black and white. It showed a fishing vessel. Weathered. Small. The name painted across the hull was unmistakable. Arlington. Ryan immediately pointed at it. That's the ship. The investigator nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid of. A knot formed in Ryan's stomach. What does that mean? The investigator opened a file. The Arlington disappeared in October of 2001. Ryan stared at him. What? It vanished during a severe storm approximately 200 miles west of the Oregon coast. The investigator slid several newspaper clippings across the table. Missing vessel. 7 crew members. No survivors. No wreckage recovered. Search suspended after 12 days. Ryan felt cold. That's impossible. That's not the strange part. The investigator handed him another document. A manufacturing report. Ryan scanned it quickly, then stopped. The survival suit. The one Daniel had been wearing. It wasn't modern emergency equipment. The manufacturer had gone out of business 25 years earlier. No surviving examples were believed to exist, and yet Daniel's suit appeared almost new. Not pristine. Used, but recently used. Like it had been stored for months, not decades. Ryan rubbed his temples. None of it made sense. What happened to him? The investigator's expression changed slightly. We don't know. Where is he now? Another pause, then, that's another problem. Ryan looked up. The investigator closed the file. Daniel Mercer disappeared from the hospital the night after he arrived. The room suddenly felt smaller. No cameras? We checked. What about security footage? The investigator hesitated, then slid one final photograph across the table. It showed a hospital hallway at 2:14 a.m. Daniel stood near an exit door, looking directly at the camera, still wearing hospital clothing, still holding the old survival suit. Ryan stared at the image. Something about it felt wrong. Then he noticed the timestamp. October 17th. Not 2026. The investigator saw his reaction. Exactly. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ryan asked the question he'd been thinking about since the meeting began. "What do you think happened?" The investigator leaned back slowly. Outside the office window, fishing boats moved across the harbor beneath a gray sky. "I think your crew rescued a man from the ocean." Ryan waited. The investigator continued. "And I think he genuinely believed his ship sank the day before." "That's it?" The man sighed. "That's the only part I can prove." The official explanation was never released publicly. The case quietly disappeared into Coast Guard archives. Most people never heard about it. Those who did assumed it was a hoax, a paperwork error, a misunderstanding, something explainable. Maybe they're right. But one detail still bothers Ryan. The coordinates where they found Daniel were later compared with historical weather records, and according to archived reports, they matched almost exactly with the last known position transmitted by the Arlington before it vanished, 25 years earlier. The same ocean, the same location, the same man, still insisting his ship had sunk yesterday.